PowerShell scripting, scope. Now, scope is a kind of a slippery little concept that a lot of folks don't take the time to understand, but really understanding how PowerShell treats scope and what scope is really, really a key to making scripts that are more effective, more self-contained, more easily maintained, easier to debug, pretty much everything. So we're going to get this really important fundamental concept out of the way, especially now that you've got some scripts that you can start playing with to see the differences in scope that I'm going to show you. We've got just a couple of main things to cover here. First being, what is scope? How does it affect your scripts? What is it exactly you have to keep in mind as you're working? And then how to work outside of your scope. So there are some rules about scope, and here's how to kind of bend the rules or break the rules, but we're also going to talk about best practices and why you want to do things in a certain way and what you can sort of run into, especially problematically, if you start breaking these scope rules. Now, once again, we're going to be talking about some pretty universal concepts, things that have existed in Windows PowerShell since the beginning. I'll be working on my Windows 8 computer, again, just because I like the Windows PowerShell 3 tools a little bit better. And we are going to start in a script file. I'm also going to keep a copy of the console up here because this is where we're going to test. The ISE behaves slightly differently when it comes to scope. And if you're running scheduled scripts or you have people running scripts, they're really not going to be running them in the ISE. So the behavior that's important to observe is the behavior in the console. Now, by the same token, it means as you're developing your scripts, it's a good idea to have a copy of the console window open because testing there really lets you test against the production style environment where your script is most likely going to be running. So I'm just going to save this as scope.ps1 to give us something to play with. Now, scope, as I mentioned a couple of nuggets ago, is a concept of containerization. When you do anything in PowerShell, it takes place in a scope. The shell here is called the global scope. This is the top level scope, and it's where everything inherits. When you run a script, that gets its own scope, which is a child of that global scope. In fact, you can kind of draw this out. You can kind of say, let's see, we've got the global scope here. And then when you run a script, that creates a container inside of that. Functions are also given their own little container. So a function inside of a script is said to be a child of that script, which is a child of the global scope. If you wanted to number these, inside the function here might be function scope 1, and then this could be 2, and this could be 3. Or if you felt like numbering them the other direction, you might say 0, 1, and 2. How you think of them doesn't really matter. PowerShell has some rules about what these numbers mean, and we're going to talk about those in just a little bit. But the idea is these are all kind of nested. Now, another way to kind of pay attention to this, at least, is there's only one global scope. So that's global. If I run a script, or I run a couple of scripts, they are completely separated from each other. They have their own separate scopes. Nothing that happens in one of them can have anything to do with the other one of them. If there's a function in here, maybe a couple of functions, and maybe this one has a function, those are also isolated from their peers, their siblings. If we're going to say that the function is a child of the script and that the script is a parent of the function, then these two functions that exist at the same level would be siblings, brothers and sisters. And they do not share, like many brothers and sisters. They have nothing to do with one another. They have separate rooms, and just because Billy paints his room blue does not mean that Susie's room suddenly turns blue as well. Nor does it mean the living room, which is part of the whole house, turns blue. Everything that happens in here stays in here, just like Las Vegas. So let's explore some of what this looks like in the shell itself. Here in the shell, I'm going to set a variable x equal to 100. And then in my script, x is x. X equals 200. So I'm using the trick in double quotes so that variable will be replaced with its contents. Now we're going to make a function. We'll call it foo. Now remember that defining a function does not execute the function. So right here is where we're actually going to call foo and make that function execute. And I'm going to have one more line. Now remember, x is starting at 100 in the global scope. Let's run that script. Oops, scope. Now let's talk exactly about what just happened, because here's where things can sometimes get a little bit confusing. The first line of the script that executed is this one. Inside the script, at this point, the variable x does not exist. And so PowerShell goes up to the parent, which is the global scope, to see if x exists there. And it does, and it has a value of 100 over in that. Right? We're over here now, so that's 100. So that's what was displayed. The first line of output is x is 100, and that value came from the global scope. This created a new variable called x in the script scope and gave it the value 200. So our next line of output shows that x contains 200. The next line that executed was foo, which takes us to here. At this point, the variable x does not exist inside the function. So the shell goes up to the parent scope, which is the script, and it sees that x is 200, and so that's our next line of output. Then a new variable called x is created inside the function's scope, and it's set to 300. So here, now x does exist in the function's scope, and that gives us our line of output over here saying that x is 300. And then we exit the function. This goes away. Our next line that executes is this one. X does exist in the script's scope, and it has always been 200, and it has never been anything different. You see, when the function ran, it didn't change x. It created a new x inside the function. That didn't change the x that lived outside the function, and so at that point in the script, it's still 200. Interestingly, if we just look at x in the global scope, it's 100. And it has always been 100 because we set it to 100 up here. It has never changed. This did not change the global scope's version of x. It created a new x inside. So the rule with scope in PowerShell is pretty simple, but not always obvious. When you try to access a scoped element, like a variable, PowerShell first looks to see if that exists in the current scope. And if it does, that's what it will use. But if you don't have that existing in the current scope, PowerShell will go up to your parent to see if it exists there. Now let's change this all to Z. And I want you, as I'm making this change, I want you to think about what the output is going to be. Now remember, you can still see the copyright message for Windows PowerShell right here in the console. This is a fresh console. Right here on line 2, PowerShell is going to try and access the contents of the variable Z. Does Z exist inside the script's scope? If not, where is PowerShell going to go look for Z? What will it find? So our first line of output, keep in mind, oops, get rid of the charms bar there. Our first line of output is here. Z is Z. Z doesn't exist in the script scope, so PowerShell goes and it looks in the shell for that. It doesn't find it. There's been no Z, and so our first line of output is empty. From there, everything's pretty much the same. We create Z in the script scope, and so we get that. Then we run the function. That creates Z in the function's scope, and we get that. Then the function goes away, and we're stuck with what's left in the script scope. And then at the end, here in the global scope, Z still doesn't contain anything because Z was never defined in this scope, and the global scope will never look into its children. The script isn't running anymore. The script is gone. It doesn't exist, and so Z never had any meaning. So there's a number of different elements in PowerShell that work this way. Variables are the most common one, and they're the ones you'll deal with probably the most. They are a scoped element. But functions are also a scoped element. So I defined this function in the script, but if I try to execute foo over here, it doesn't exist because it only existed in this script. Once the script stopped running, foo no longer existed. And although the script knew about foo, it never told its parent about foo. It's kind of like when your daughter has a boyfriend sneak in the window at night. So long as the boyfriend doesn't leave the daughter's scope, the daughter's room, the parents who live in the global scope will never know unless they make noise. So that's the idea behind this, is that everything is self-contained and stays where it's put. Now that's not to say you can't go messing with things. For example, let's get rid of this line for a second. I'm actually just going to comment it out. Set variable. Change the variable name z in the global scope and change it to value 500. Save. What does z contain? Nothing. Run my scope script. What does z contain? 500. Because line 4 of my script explicitly set the variable z not in the script scope. It reached up into its parent's room and changed it. Susie has left her room and now she's messing around with mom's makeup. So she's come out of her scope and she's messing around with the global scope, and that becomes a permanent change. If I run that same script again, z starts at 500 because it was modified in the global scope by the script's previous execution. Another way of doing that is that. That's exactly the same type of syntax. Now, similarly, let's leave that there. Try and predict what that's going to do. Let's clear the screen over here. What's z equal? 500. Let's set z equal to 9 in the global scope, and then we'll run our scoped script. So let's walk through what happened here. My first line of output is here. Z is z. Well, I set it to 9, and so that's what it says. My next thing is to change the global scope's z to 500 and then create a script scoped z that is 200. Because I did not use the global keyword here, I'm accessing through normal PowerShell rules. What is z? Well, z exists in your current scope and it is 200. There you go, buddy. Next line executes foo. What is z? Well, z doesn't exist in your scope, so I'm going to look at your parent. And in your parent, z is 200. There you go. Now I'm changing my script scope z to 300. Okay, what is z? Z doesn't exist in the function's scope. I'm going to go up to your parent scope, and now it's 300. And then when I get down here, what's z? Well, z exists in your scope, and it's 300. And so that shows you how you can change things outside your own scope. If I look at z now, it's 500 because it was changed here in the global scope on line 5. Let's be very clear about something. This is a poor practice. You don't want to go messing with mom's makeup. You shouldn't be reaching out into your neighbors' houses and messing with their things because you don't know what processes might be depending on those things. The global scope is not a valid way to pass information between scripts. And that's how some folks will use it. I'm going to run this script now. And so I'm going to set this information because I'm then going to run another script. Oops, that's right, host. I'm going to write another script that uses that global value. That's a really poor practice. For one, it's possible this script might someday need to run in a PowerShell host that doesn't properly maintain a global scope, and that's entirely possible. It also makes it difficult to debug this. What the heck is Z? Where in the world is it coming from? Why is it coming from the global scope? How is it getting set? If this script is going to run this script, and this script wants to pass a piece of information to this script, there's a proper way to do that, and it is by declaring a parameter block. And instead of setting a global value when you call the script, you would just say scope2 myz, whatever value you wanted to pass it. This makes it very clear that we're calling a script and giving it this piece of information. We're not just dumping the information into the global scope and hoping someone will pick it up. We're very clearly passing the information. This script is very clearly accepting that piece of information. Somebody else reading this goes, well, where the heck is my z coming from? Oh, it's a defined parameter. I'm going to look at whoever's running this, and that's where that information is coming from. I'm not just randomly picking it up out of the dumpster that is the global scope. I have a defined means for that piece of information to come into this script. So there's actually a whole little list of scoped elements that work this way. I mentioned a couple of them. I mentioned that we had variables, which is what we've mainly been playing with. There's also functions, aliases, and PS drives. Those are all scoped items. So let's have a little fun with one of those, actually. Let's play with aliases. We'll call this scope alias. That's the name of the script. New alias, name, d, value, get child item. Right? So I can run d, and it should give me a directory listing. Let's try it. Scope alias. I got a directory listing. So now I can run d. Well, d is not recognized. That's because this was defined in the script's scope. Once the script went away, this alias no longer existed. It was not created in the global scope. If you look, though, at the help for new alias, you can specify the scope. I can create it in the global scope. And in fact, there's another way of specifying scopes. If you look at the full help here and you look at the scope parameter, you can specify global, local, which is the current scope, and that's the default anyway. That's where things normally get created, or script, or 0 being the current scope, 1 being its parent, and so forth. So instead of global, 0 is my current scope. I'll create it in my parent. Watch how this can get away from you, though. I'm going to run scope 2. And in here, we're just going to run scope alias. Now, I want you to think about what I'm doing here. In fact, let's draw the picture. I've got my global scope. Yes. And then I'm running scope2.ps1, which is in turn running scope alias.ps1. This is defining an alias called D, and it's doing that in scope number 1. Well, this is scope 0. My parent is 1. The global would become 2. So I'm going to run scope 2. I got my directory listing. That means D got defined. So let's try running D. See, it doesn't exist because this created it in its parent. This was the parent. When it went away, everything in here went away. Now let's just run scope alias from this level. Now D exists. See, I'm going to keep running it. D. I defined it in my parent. That time, the parent was my global scope. So messing around with scope can get really, really tricky, really, really fast. My preference is to not mess with it. I like to only mess with things in my own scope. In fact, I don't like to use a variable until I have given it a value in the current scope. That keeps me honest. That way I know it's not pulling a value from somewhere else. So now you know what scope is. It's a container. It's a line in the sand that's painted around your strips or functions, and whatever happens inside of them is largely restricted to inside of them, although there are some rules where outside scopes can come into play. Now, it's a best practice. You never want to assume that you're getting something valid from outside your scope because you don't know where your script is going to be running in the end. And you don't ever want to go modifying outside of your scope because you don't know what you might be messing up. So there are definitely ways to do things that are kind of proper and more maintainable and less likely to create buggy situations. And the more you can stick with those rules, the happier in general you will be. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.